Consemble, Weapon, Attack Power i Natural. HP Natural Recover.
Structure of reality itself tells you something, it's best to listen since there's no way out of it, but that's not what Cain does. He's so incensed by his sensual vulnerability, compromised and exacerbated by his failure to make the appropriate sacrifices and to conduct himself appropriately, that he decides then and there, number one, to destroy his ideal, to reduce the tension that he feels when that ideal exists as a contrast point, and number two, to destroy the favorite son of God. And so he goes out into the field and kills Abel. And God comes along and says, "Where's my favorite son?" And Cain says, "I killed him." And it's so interesting to me that that story is placed, really, it's the third story in the Old Testament. It's with the archaic stories. And it's a story that reveals, as far as I can tell, that there are two essential patterns of reaction to the self-conscious, vulnerable conditions of existence. And one is humble approach to infinity with determined attempts to make the appropriate sacrifices. The other is arrogance.
Jebote, 30. level sam na ovome Hepe.
And the degeneration of the soul into something that's homicidally murderous. Well, the story doesn't stop there, and it gets really compressed in this part, and that's perhaps because some of it's been lost with the passages of time. But the next thing that happens is that God doesn't punish Cain. And you think, that's kind of strange. I mean, the Old Testament God, he's punishing people left, right, and center. It's right. Why not Cain? And you think, well, he marks Cain, and he says to the people who are around that they should leave him alone because he's been marked by God as to be left alone. And the reason for that, I think, and this is something that's reflected in our legal system, is that murder promotes revenge, and revenge destroys societies. And so God puts an end to the situation right there and then by telling people that despite the fact that Cain has committed a terrible crime, that there will be no retribution. Cain goes off and gets married, and he has a number of generations of offspring. If you insult a member of the first generation of Cain's offspring, he doesn't kill you, he kills 7 of you. And if you insult a member of the second generation of Cain's offspring, he doesn't kill 7 of you, he kills 7 times 7 of you. And then on down the road of the offspring of Cain is Tubal-Cain. And Tubal-Cain is the artificer of weapons of war. And this stunningly brilliant story says in its incredibly compressed fashion that the motivation that drives the commission of the worst human atrocities is an inevitable social consequence of the refusal of the self-conscious individual to make the sacrifices appropriate to establishing a harmonious life, and their consequent degeneration into a kind of murderous and resentment-filled rage propagating endlessly through its variations in society until everything comes to an end. And the next story is the flood. And it's not surprising, because if things go from bad to worse long enough, everything falls. And it's a terrifying story, and I didn't understand that story. I didn't understand that story for years. It wasn't really until I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn that I developed, I think, the cognitive capacity to even understand what the story meant, because Solzhenitsyn said in his Nobel Prize accepting speech, a single person who stops lying can bring down a tyranny, which is a stunning thing to say.
God.
But I would also say something that's been amply demonstrated in the 20th century, because we have historical examples of people who did precisely that. Gandhi did it. Václav Havel did it. Nelson Mandela did it. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was definitely one of the axe blows that brought down the Soviet Union. A stunning achievement for a person who started writing that book by memorizing it when he was a concentration camp victim this far away from starvation. It shows you, as clearly as anything possibly can, how powerful the human spirit can be if it's willing to take on the obligation of its relationship with the divine, and also how terrible things can become if the responsibility of that burden is not shouldered. Now, it's no wonder as far as I can tell that people don't think this way, because thinking this way it's catastrophic in a way, because the burden it places on the individual is so extreme that it's almost unbearable. That's exactly why it is in Genesis, because becomes conscious of his own vulnerability. People such as I could never bear such a burden. Well, there's a lot more to people than meets the eye. And the only way I learned that was by looking at people's and my own capacity for evil, because I started to realize that we regard ourselves as narrow little beings in a particular kind of box. And there's real comfort in that, although there's tremendous limitation. You cannot see your way out of that box until you know what I teach my students. I teach them about Nazi Germany, and I try to make them understand that there's an overwhelming probability if they were in Nazi Germany in the 1930s that they would have been perpetrators and Nazis. An overwhelming probability. And if they can't accept that, because it's a historical fact, they have absolutely no idea who they are. Now, imagining yourself as a Nazi perpetrator is an unbearably terrifying thing to do. But I don't believe that you can I don't think that you have any insight whatsoever into your capacity for good until you have some well-developed insight into your capacity for evil. Because people can tell you till they're blue in the face about your capacity for good. It just sounds like wishful thinking. It sounds like the sort of thing that an advertiser might do. It's just too good to be true. And I don't think you can. But I think that if you tell people that in the cold, dark corners of their mind there are motivations that are so terrible that they would traumatize themselves if they were ever revealed, that everyone knows that some of them is absolutely true. Do you think there's evidence to be enlightened? And you think, since enlightenment is viewed as the medication for vulnerability and death, then everybody would be struggling as hard as they possibly could to be enlightened, if such a state exactly and precisely exists. But if the barrier to enlightenment is the development of self-consciousness of the individual human's infinite capacity for evil, then you can be immediately convinced about why enlightenment is in such short supply. When I finished my first provisional examination of the sorts of motivations that drove people to set up concentration camps and to torture people terribly in those camps, I came to a terrible conclusion. It was a conclusion that I think in some ways was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, maybe intellectually and morally. I thought, I came to understand why it is that people depended on their group identity and their cultural identification, because that helped protect themselves from their own vulnerability. You have to believe things because you just don't know everything. So you have to believe things. They fill in the gaps. The beliefs fill in the gaps. If the beliefs are stripped from you, then your defenses against the enemy are stripped. It's no wonder that people will defend their beliefs. If you're too willing to kill
Never drag you.
defense, and you're so you can no longer be willing to kill other people. The time for that is past. Don't stand up for your beliefs and use yourself to the open to the depredations of the infinite. That's equally horrible. It seems to leave no way out. There is a way out, and I think it's the way out that genuinely religious people have tried to offer humanity for thousands and thousands of years. And the way out of the conundrum posed to you by your reliance on ideological beliefs and your vulnerability in the face of the unknown is the development of a truly integrated and powerful character. And that's individual development. And it means constant confrontation with things you don't understand and constant attempts to ensure that your character is composed of truth and solidity rather than deceit, and to make of yourself something that's built on a rock and not predicated on sand. And the thing is, it's one thing to tell people that because maybe they should take care of themselves, but I don't know if that's enough to tell people because they don't take care of themselves that well. But it's a completely other thing to say, look, every time you make a pathological moral decision, you move the world one step closer to you. And I absolutely believe that. I think that this is crystal clear. And I also think that every time you make a appropriate moral decision and you manifest moral courage in the face of moral vulnerability, then you move the world one step farther from the brink. And that's the case for every single person. Solzhenitsyn said, drawing on his Eastern Orthodox Christian background, every single person is the center of the world. Ask not less of the world. The world's a complicated place. It can have all sorts of centers. It's hard to believe that you might be one of them, but everything about human existence is hard to believe. The fact that it's here at all is hard to believe. The nature of its consistently and constantly unfolding miracle. The idea that each of you might be a center of the cosmos in that infinite admixture of ridiculousness and absurdity is hardly more than one more ridiculous thing to swallow. Well, I'll summarize, I guess.
Utekao sam na
He
vrijeme.
said that tragedy is a precondition for being.
Počeo već me ubijati ovi majmuni
Being is
malo.
the interplay between the finite and the infinite, and in that interplay there's tragedy, and there's no way out of that. Evil's something different.
Šta? Tako i treba.
Evil's the conscious attempt to make the conditions of existence more pathological than they have to be. And it's motivated by conscious intent. The motivations arise because people pay a terrible price for their self-conscious awareness, and that awareness is their awareness of their vulnerability. And that is a terrible thing to be aware of.
Ja cvijeće malo sabijam.
Rightly accepted and the appropriate decisions made. Alternatively, people can retreat into their own rationalistic arrogance and attempt to see themselves about the nature of their own existence and about the nature of reality. That happens to nothing but destruction. I think that there's good reason to assume that it's too late in our development, of course, as a species, for that path to be accepted because we're too powerful. And if too many people stand on the path, we'll do ourselves in. And so I would say, as we become more technologically powerful and increasing more work, it matters the destiny of the cosmos, whether or not you give it more of that strength. And I don't mean that in a trivial way. I believe that that's a perfect fact. Anything can be demonstrated. And I also believe that's as terrifying a thing to consider as and maybe it's too much to ask of you. You know, our great traditions do continually remind us that inside every human being there is a spark of divinity. And that idea is a precondition for our entire system of law. There's always a possibility that it's true. And if it's true, there's a
Popisati i ostali. You can do it. Crveno sam nešto dobio, vidjet ćemo šta.
the terrible conditions of reality into something not only acceptable but worthy of celebration actually lies within our grasp. And the alternative to that is the continual generation of a kind of hell that's so incomprehensibly awful that by any reasonable person's standards, it has to be regarded as something fearful. That's all I have to say about that.
Gdje da mi to crveno otvorimo da ima tissue ređe... Fuck me. Govno malo.
I want to talk to you today about what I think is a relatively new way of looking at your experience, but maybe even more broadly than that, a new way of looking at reality itself. You all come to university, I suppose, to make your conceptions of reality more sophisticated. And you want to do that because you have to live in the world. And the more sophisticated your conceptions, the less likely you'll encounter tragic or harmful circumstances that you will be unable to deal with. It really matters if you know what you're thinking and you know how to think. Over the last 20 years, I would say, there's been a revolution in psychology. And the revolution has involved the transformation of the way
Došao je
that we look
neki
at the world.
nubina.
And that's what I want to talk to you about
A
today.
jester.
I entitled this talk
Tu smo mi
Reality in the
jester
Just
Strange.
ti.
nubina.
It's a strange
Evo ga.
title for a talk to modern
Znaš neka,
people
nazad,
who
ne znam.
don't really understand what this is.
Šta ćete zvati? Nazovite ni mene.
Ne znam, ja kad sam na posti nisam.
I wouldn't say archaic, but at least traditional for modern.
Ja kada dođem kud, dok se obavim ti na...
Ti kad si na posle spavam.
Anachronistic or
Nemoj da spavaš.
Kad ustaneš sam...
So I want to start with a story from the Old Testament. We see in the Old Testament when the ancient Hebrews are building the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is a device that was manufactured in order to contain the word of
Znaš ti
God.
bolan je ovo?
And there was a rule
Moja.
among the Hebrews that
No.
you were not to touch the Ark
Evo, pičim WoW. Igram Pandario na retilu.
Dario,
Ja, klasika,
ti
Pandarija.
to možeš da biraš, jel?
Mogu da biram što ću igrati.
Znači, možeš da igraš stari Breath of the Lich King, jel tako?
Mislim da mogu, nemam pojma, nisam to gledao.
Ajde pokušaj da vidiš.
Ma neću.
Ajde ba, za mene.
But what the story is designed to indicate, in my opinion, is that there are certain things that you touch at your peril,
Šta pričaj?
regardless of your intentions. And those things that you touch at your
Znači, mob klasik, Midnight, Burning Crusade i to je to.
is regarded as sacred. As
Ne
a
može.
Nema vrata od Lich King.
those things exist and also
Nema
why
lot,
they exist,
bot
why it's
look.
necessary for you to know that.
Šta je Nino?
I would also say
Ja
that
tebe kad zovem, ja tebe zovem.
the university,
Sad mi
especially
se
with regards to
nazovete,
the
ali ja.
humanities, which are in some
Ja ne
conceptual
znam,
trouble
ta
at the moment.
slobodna kad...
Najbolje da odješ Nino napolje tamo kod komšinice pa da pričaš sa mnom. Možda bi te čuo nešto bolje.
Tula glavu dole u ovu, kak se zove, u toru. A zombi menu
Šno.
Now, I'm going to tell you first how you think about the world, I think. So, this would be a
Rekao se zvat pa nisi.
Newtonian and deterministic. And
Strašno.
Ma,
this
druže.
worldview that dominated psychology and economics and anthropology and political science.
Rekao sam i prije kod nje cuvo mjesto pa i vakumirat pa nisam, pa šta, evo me živi.
But it's come to a crashing halt in the last
Su
50
nisu
years.
akumirao mes.
And the consequences of that manifest in a number of domains.
Još imam drugih stvari o kojima trebam voditi računa.
Something like this.
Ne mogu voditi o svemu.
The world is made out of objects.
Da, i
You look
svega.
at the world, you see the objects. There they are in front of you. As a consequence of seeing the objects, you think about what to do. And after you think about what to do, and
Evo kaže, Nena sad će doći.
you act.
Ma nek dođi.
Now that seems self-evident.
A znam ja da će ona
You look
doći.
at the world, there the objects are. And it appears to you that you see them, and then you think about them, and then you act.
Pitaj te željno
But
čekaš.
there's a real problem with that.
A?
Jel ti mene željno čekao?
First problem is,
Ja.
use half your brain to see.
To srećem se doći.
And the reason that the visual cortex
Pa ne dođi i treba doći.
as far as we can tell, actually impossible. Now the fact that seeing perception is impossible wasn't discovered by psychologists and it wasn't discovered by philosophers. It was discovered
Malo kod svoje djeci.
by people working on
A ja.
artificial intelligence and trying to make artificial
Kod svaka majka požela se malo.
The presupposition of the people who were making intelligent machines was the hard part.
Nenadu, mama je rekla da ga se požela, on onda pobjegne u Ameriku. I on dalje.
See objects
Ne treba dalje.
Jel? Nemoj na Greenland dole. Novi Zeland je tu.
Šta ćemo tamo?
how are we able to separate things up at all? So you think about yourself. When you look in the mirror, you see yourself as an object. You see your eyes, your nose, you see your face, you see your body, and that's pretty much what you see when you look at other people. But that isn't all there is to you. In fact, that's hardly any of what exists. So you can say, for example, you exist at the level of the quantum particle. You can't perceive that. In fact, you
Okay,
didn't know
Zika.
that until 75 years ago. Above that level, you exist at the atomic level, and then molecular level. And then you exist at the level of complex organs, and then the interactions between those organs. And then you. And then your family. And then the groups that your family belong to. And then the ecosystem that the groups of your, or that all your groups belong to. And so on and so forth until what it is that you are can expand to encompass
Crveni
virtually anything.
materijal opet.
Now, when you look at yourself, you don't see that. You see yourself at a certain level of resolution. When you look at the world, you see yourself at a certain level of
Grenade još
resolution.
gore.
But all those other levels
Čem-
are equally real.
Ma,
and
ubio
equally
onoga
relevant.
Titana, no, dobio
And we,
crveni
in
kao,
fact, have very
kao
little
čegi
idea
smoke
how it is
grenade.
that you're only able to see what you see. Almost nothing has obvious boundaries. And this has real world consequences. It's not something that's merely abstract. The technical term for this problem, and the problem of how to bind your perceptions, to limit them, is called the frame problem. The frame problem was discovered about 40 years ago, and the philosopher Daniel Dennett called it the most important philosophical discovery of the last 50 years. The frame problem emerges to cause all sorts of trouble for people. So, for example, when Henry Ford invented the automobile, well, at least invented the modern procedure of building the automobile, what Ford presumed was that he was building an efficient means of transporting people from one place to the other. There were other unintended consequences of Ford's discovery. So, for example, Ford happened to be a great supporter of fascism. And the reason that he was a supporter of fascism was because he regarded the fascist
Boss.
political structure as a logical extension of the efficient methods that he'd used to assemble vehicles. So his mode of production was instantly manifested in a political philosophy. Furthermore, now, 2009, 100 years after the invention of the automobile, we've discovered some other things that the car was other than a place to move people from point A to point B. So, for example, it turns out that the automobile and the internal combustion engine are among the most effective technologies ever devised to transform the nature of the atmosphere and to heat up the world. Not only that, the car has completely transformed the nature of cities. And these are all unintended consequences of the fact that the car was far more than what people thought it was. You can say that about any technological structure. No one knew what TV would do.
Ajoj.
No one knew what the internet would do to the music industry. Everything that you interact with is far more complicated than you see. The most ancient ideas we have are breaking into a certain presupposition. And the presupposition is this. There's two fundamental modes of being that characterize reality. One is the absolute. And the absolute is the sum total of everything.
Ubiše opet ovoga.
If you think of things in their infinite number of
Neće
potential
meni biti dovoljno ni
variations,
100
you can think
komada
about
ali
that
za
as one
oživljavanje.
whole reality. It appears classically that people have regarded their encounters with the absolute, which is all those multiple levels of being that are beyond your perceptual capacity, as equivalent to an encounter with God. Now, you know that in the Islamic religion, it's against the rules to make a graven image of any sort of Muhammad, right? The idea is that you're not supposed to make an image. And among the ancient Hebrews, the idea was very similar. The Taoists say that you shouldn't confuse
Ti na
the moon
Twilight
when
tamo.
you're pointing to the moon.
Nisam,
And what all
nisam
that means is that the
ubijam
absolute is
šćute.
always something that transcends the finite frame
A
that
na
you
klasi-
put around your
Da,
perceptions.
da.
So as soon as you start talking about it, representing it,
Ubijam
making statues of
šćute,
it, or idolizing
pa
it,
ću
you lose
onda
your
na
connection
bossa
with the
i to je
absolute,
to za
because you've
danas.
turned it into something that's understandable and concrete. Part of the wisdom traditions that the world still maintains make the constant moral presupposition that you should always be aware of what it is that transcends both your understanding and your perception. And you should keep firmly in mind that that exists. Now, when people talk about God in the modern world, they tend to think about something that's more, has more the characteristics of a being. And I suppose that's where most of the debate about religious reality comes
Znači,
in.
boš.
But the idea that there's an absolute that's outside of your perceptual
Zato što je
capacity seems to
šćuto,
me to be
dropa, ako
merely a
dropa
statement of
oni
fact,
krvice,
especially given
mogu
what
i
we
da je
know
prodam za
now
crvene
about the nature of
gemice.
perception.
Vole ljudi kupovati
Phenomena
to.
always transcends the manner in which you frame it. We've also come to understand that not only does reality have multiple levels of existence, but in order to perceive it, you have to stand inside multiple frames. This is a picture of a French city. It's a walled city. Now, the walls are there to keep and the walls are there to keep what isn't in the walls out. And so you can think about that as a protective structure. Now, I want to tell you how
Gdje umriš šćuto pa da mogu ostale pobiti.
exactly what that means. So, for example, you think about this room, and I'm going to tell you how it is that this room allows you to see what it is that you see. Now, when you're interacting with a computer, you actually don't interact with the computer. You interact with the keyboard and the screen. If the computer crashes, then you interact with the computer. And you find that, as a general rule, very annoying, because you don't really understand the computer very well, and you don't actually see how complex it is until it stops working. Most of the time when you're interacting with the world, you're doing things with the world. You're interacting with it in a way that produces some consequence that you want. And that means in part that your perceptions are
Tako da
always
znači
framed by
postoji
what you
šansa
want.
ako
And
bude
that's
bit
actually
će
one of the reasons why the world isn't just made out of objects. The world
ajde
is made out of
preskoči
things you use and
jebote.
things that get in your way. Now, you're always applying a frame like that to the world in order to simplify it enough so that you can understand it. And you're aided in this process by all sorts of processes you really don't notice. Because when you look at the world, you think, well, there are the objects. But there's 1,000 things going on before you make that judgment. So, we'll look at this room. When you walk in here, the room tells you what to do. The reason it tells you what to do is because all the seats are pointing in the same direction. They're all slanted in a particular way. When you walk in here and there's other people sitting, you can see that all their faces
Kad
are
ulaziš,
to
kad
the front.
Ma
People's
za
faces point
3-4
towards what
minutice
interests them. The
da
room is
pobijem
set up
još
to
2
make you face
šćuta.
the front. The theory behind the room is that the thing that's interesting in the room is happening at the front. It's a theater. What's happening at the front is a drama.
Jel ti Vika još nije došao?
To promote
Nije.
and undergird the drama.
Jesse, Johnny,
Dramatic act.
Jessica nema ovdje.
The room tells
šta
you
ima?
what to do. So you don't have to think
Jo, zombikaris.
like this. You can just do it.
Kakavski čovjek,
Hm?
And then you
kakavski čovjek.
Mutan.
You can sit in here in relative comfort and listen to this lecture.
Mutan ko zombi.
Da, zombikusi.
Zombikus.
Ovo je event, krati po ljubi.
Boss, taman si došao.
Pa ne, igrao sam ja, pričao sam ja samo... Hoće divljak da skine, brate.
Pa nek skini. Zovi ga.
Jebi, onak neki čovjek nije.
Kaže, ajde vidim kako to, šta, kako, rekao, aj sad ću ti opali stream, pa...
Johnny, ja sam im rekao tamo da ti je preminula majka, da niješ neko vrijeme dolaz na vlog, tako da...
Kome?
Ovima
Tamo gildu?
tamo, ne, da te ne izbacuju bez ili nešto.
Pa neće, nisam izgledao, rekao sam ja mikru, brate, da je ja... Ali nisam
Nek
rekao da je...
izbaci. Jeboj.
Ma da, rekao sam...
Ako do toga, znači
Da.
izbaci.
Nego rekao sam, brate, još onda dok je živio bilo da neću moći zbog nje, ali nisam rekao da je preminula.
Ali nisi ni potalio ovo pa da ponovo igrao ova. 6 minutica.
Mi smo svi obišli, čovjek dođe i pula sve kripove, pa ja ne znam, bro.
Tako i treba.
Da čuti graman s Warriora u pive, evo.
Dobro.
To je posao.
Je to onaj za PvP?
Da.
To tako i treba.
No viš druže kako ja to krljam.
Kako treba.
A reći o meni kao nije nikakav problem, samo kaže što.
Ma, znam on kikat tako ti koji nisu aktivni, znaš, i onda.
Ne, pa neće. Prije zgotivio me. Zgotivili smo se, što se kaže.
Piće i ostalo.
Ne, te par dana odmah te kiku. Dobro, ja mogu slakat, mene neće kikat, zašto se mi baš dugo znamo.
Ma ni mene nije.
Ma napijemo ga, znači odmah, kad kika.
Bio je sada u Litford. Ne nade. Mikrologiju.
Boli me. Znači, zavoli me kurac, jebo, Litvorn više prekinu to, nemoj više to spominjati, znači,
samo
da
Litford.
znam uopšte.
To Nenad ima bad iskustva.
Ma nije neko prestao igrati, gotovo, znači...
Nenad ima lošeg iskustva, mogu ja tebe reći, Johnny, sam neće da ti prizna.
Dobro,
Mi smo svi dobili doda, jedino on nije.
Da, ne da je bilo iskustvo, nego u pičku maternu, znači... Napravili onaj prevar sa onim shadow pristovima i jebote sunce, ja jedini izgine.
Nije problem što on izginuo, brate, nego što njega, on je poginuo i pao dole kroz platformu, druže, njega ni onaj boss nije mogao resat koliko je bio daleko.
A tepala, znači, propao na drugu stranu planete.
A da šta ga Valkira bacila?
Ma jabola, znači...
Ja sam ušao u ovaj.
Tu smo.
Da čupnim za početak. Dobrodošli.
Evo ga
And the
tič.
person tells them that they've had an affair.
A njega udri on neki čovjek.
Njega nikakav čovjek nije. Evo ga.
Future you imagine no longer
E, ali
exists.
ček sam da meni čita da ja
Sad
mogu
neko čita.
zvratiti. Da ja mogu zvratiti, nije fair, druž. Tuče ovako na
Ja.
ja sam AFK.
Pa ja.
E, aj sad. Čekaj,
Nisi
čiče
AFK,
zvati.
ja?
E, aj sad.
Gle.
I kako se ovaj
O
zove.
jebot stavu.
Leže čovjek. Aha.
When that happens to you, your
Yeah,
brain
man.
knows exactly what to do. It stops thinking about the future. It stops saving up resources for the future. It puts you in emergency preparation mode. So you're
Da te šakom.
anything at the drop of a hat.
Od prošli put se ušao go.
Šta te voli briga?
Shifts the cortisol levels up. It activates
Dođi vam.
cortices.
Dođi vam.
Your limbic
Evo,
system
evo
and
me
motivation
naprijed,
system
prvi
are
sam.
disinhibited, turned on,
Gdje je čuč?
Ima.
and you sweat and
Ti
you
čuč.
can't sleep. Because the
Jedan da čučni, ne oba dvojica.
that provided you with security and direction has now disappeared. The Taoists believe
Da
that
legnem,
the world is
znači
always
može.
an interplay between chaos and order, and that if
A
you
ja ću čučnut
Sad
to.
čuš,
one foot
sad
in
čuš
order,
sad na njega. Sad
one foot in chaos. Because if you're only in order,
dancing.
that's interesting ever happens to you.
Evo ga
Nothing is
Cabbage,
anything
znači
but a
čovjek
repeat
će
of all
izubijati
of all
sve
the things
bol,
that
te
you
mazo.
already
Ima
know.
čovjek
Još
ma-
ima-
onaj kalaš,
Još ima pušku,
kalaš,
brat.
šljašti kalaš, znači bože.
And if you're in a state that's only characterized by chaos,
Mhm.
you're at sea
A ne,
or overwhelmed,
popneš se, ali ne
things
možeš
are falling
ostati.
apart for you. And there's too much of everything for you to deal with. Now the Taoists, being very wise people, know other things as well. They know, for example, that chaos can turn into order. That's why there's a
Oho,
white dot in the middle of the
video je
black
što
dot.
leta
Hey,
ovdje
Aha.
guzicom, dobre jebote, sunce.
Glumim cviku.
Tako i treba.
White paisley.
Gledaj, ne da to pliva.
Sa njom i ja
The
plivam.
optimally meaningful life is to be found on the border
Da,
between
izbaci me iz plivanja.
And I would say that your
Da
nervous
zašto se ja
system
pomerio
tells you
s tim?
exactly
Stisnem
who you
Ctrl i
are
on
in
se
this
baci
kind of
nazad.
place, and you can
Pa
tell that you're
joj.
there because you're secure enough to be confident, but not so secure that
Dva
you're bored, and you're interested enough to be awake, but not so interested that you're terrified. And when you're in a state like that, when you find things interesting and meaningful, time slips by you and you're no longer self-conscious. This is a medieval Christian representation of the nature of reality. On the outside,
Bio
you
se
have the
zevao i
Virgin Mary.
uspavalom pivo, brat.
Inside the Virgin Mary, you have God the Father. And God the Father is supporting a crucifix with an individual on it. The individual in Christian thinking is Christ. What does this image mean? The walled city divides order from chaos, or order from nature. We think about nature as the thing that's outside of what we understand. That's Mother Nature. Mother Nature gives birth to all things.
Evo,
That's
opet
the
nisam
idea
ponio
that's expressed
bombe
in this image.
da ubacim.
So the Virgin Mary is standing for Mother Nature. Out of Mother Nature arises order and tradition. That's true for primates like chimpanzees as much as it's true for us. Any social animals that are grouped together have to form an orderly
Empty
structure
sunce.
that they can inhabit
Znači,
together that defines their boundaries and their goals, because otherwise they fight each other to the death. So in the state of untrammeled nature, as Hobbes pointed out, it's every man for himself. And without the order that tradition brings, there's nothing but chaos. And chaos is murderous and unproductive. Well, there's a problem with order. If you look at the history of the 20th century, it's a toss-up whether Mother Nature has been harder on us or whether our governmental traditions have been harder on us. You know, of course, that the dictatorship of Hitler killed 6 million Jews, 120 million people in the Second World War. You may not know that the Stalinist dictatorship in the Soviet Union killed an estimated 60 million people in internal repression, not counting the people who died.
Pa nemoj odmah mene jebem u lebac.
Characterized Mao's communist China killed 100 million people. And so the problem with tradition is that sometimes it's a vice, and sometimes it's a
Glej, ne odustaj od mene.
moraš dobiti.
guide us in structure or even the manner in which we perceive the world. Our traditions can become archaic and outdated, cruel and inhuman, and as a consequence, they can pose a worse threat to us than chaos itself. Nature
A jebo ga sunce, nemoj mi okretat leđa.
Noga.
Ma ja, sad sam i ja vidio. Evo mene ščućao. Luka.
Igram budi.
Leđa.
And the terrible aspect of nature that frees everyone. And you can be sure, and you'll be seldom taught, that you will encounter that at some point in your life. The primary goodness
Jebo ga sunce.
Mislim da sam 21. završio.
it means that because you're finite,
Piše mi da sam
22.
10. Piše mi da sam 10.
it is
Ja,
Jebe, dragi, 1.400.000 napravio.
because there's always
ja sam 13.
Joj,
Ja najgori od sve djece, 22.
and worse than that. And it's for this reason that tyrannies can't last.
znam šta je bilo.
The thing that you're contending with isn't even static. It keeps
Sjebalo me ona
so that what worked for you
tuto
yesterday
i sjebalo me 2 put kašlje.
30 poenčića, 5000 mile. Pa dobro je
It's an
to.
alchemical version of the Taoist yin and yang symbol, and basically it says
Unaprijedio
something
sam
that's more
Kalašnjikov sa plus 3 na
sophisticated
plus
and complex. It
5.
says that the world's
Odmah
made
malo
up of
bolje
chaos
udara.
and order.
Kako ne? Pa ja sam pucao sa onom crvenom nula, nije napređeno uopšte.
And inside the
Imaš
order, there's
17.000
chaos, and
penetracije,
inside
jel
that
tako?
chaos, there's some
Da,
order,
da,
and
da.
inside that order, there's some chaos,
Kalašnjikov
and so
plus
on
5,
and so
znaš koliko
forth.
ima?
And equally the
Mm-mm.
case for
Šta misliš?
order.
Pa ne znam.
16.700.
Da.
Znači,
A ja imam onaj UMP, onaj
Ja.
žuti što smo dobili na 40,
Dobro.
na sad ću reći koliko ima, isto plus 5.
ja,
Sad ću reći koliko ima, samo da čita.
Two things you'll always have to contend with. And finally, in this representation, you have a representation of the individual, at least.
Ajde da raz, šta se dešava?
And that's Christ, and it's a terrifying representation. It's a remarkable representation because it's not a representation of transcendence, it's a representation of suffering. And it's a funny kind of representation of suffering because the manner in which the story unfolds is this.
Ima 16.900.
As the
Zamalo.
archetypal individual,
A tak
tamo
power,
imaš obična 17.
psychological
17, da. Attack power 1700, attack power 1900.
Tako da, kažem ja, znači ovoj dvojici kad smo tumačili to neki dan, jučer, danas, treba ti
To se ne mogu teleportovati u toj gore zoni.
Jel piše da trebaš da...
treba ti 17.000 da imaš da bi mogao nešto praviti ovim 45. levelima.
Gdje?
Čega 17.000?
Penetracije.
Idem gore na onu...
To je samo da im praviš normalni damage,
Attack
znači.
power to elite zombies, to ćemo i tu idem da uvatim. Znači još 1, 2, 3 levela i taman ću to gore kliknuti.
Gore trebamo ubiti 50 zombi.
To se ja rešio.
50 zombija.
I reši 60 zombija.
Slušaj, bit će kasnije 80, bit će 100,
Da,
bit će
da,
200, bit će svašta nešto.
Ju vi šta imamo oružje, a ćemo sad da...
Samo rokaj.
2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 19, samo u oružjima. Armor, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. I ja sad kad se to sve pretoči. Not enough.
individual. It's a very strange thing, but you know, you still see this. You still see people doing things like this that they don't notice. I went to a museum in New York, and there were a very large number of paintings there from the late Renaissance, and they were all religiously themed, like medieval paintings, except they featured recognizable individuals. And people had come from all over the world to look at those paintings. They're extremely valuable paintings, you know, they were painted by Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, and each of them was probably valued. The reasons that are very difficult to understand at something approximating hundreds of millions of dollars. The late
Ovo sad ne
Renaissance
treba
was
gledati
the
4
first time in
sata.
human history where human
Da.
beings dared to presume
Twitch.
that sacred
Za?
images could be given an
Pa
individual
od neke
human
to
face.
kin nešto.
And that
Za
idea
tenkove?
was actually what
Ja.
launched
Ja,
Enlightenment
Opet?
and launched the development of modern
pa valjda.
culture. The late Renaissance
A
thinkers,
ja
the
po
artists,
nedeljak
A,
posle
vrat.
5 sati
Koliko
nova
i ti nisam bio u tenku, ne znam kako.
between these sacred
Pa nemam
images
pojma, ja
and
sam neki
actual
Twitch
paintings.
završio.
And people come from all
Ma
over the world to look
opet
at these
imaš
paintings,
novi.
even though they don't understand what they
Mi
mean.
jebati.
I want to show you some images that describe how the idea of the suffering individual developed and
Idemo,
what that
idemo.
means. The first thing I want to show you is this picture of St. George and the Dragon. Now, you know the main street that runs through the university is named after St. George, right? This is a very old image. The oldest story we know, which is a Mesopotamian creation myth,
Ja mogu iz
features
tebe napraviti.
a god who confronts a reptilian monster and makes the world as a consequence of the conflict. He faces her, she's terrifying, he cuts her up in pieces and all the pieces in explode. Now the Mesopotamians, 5,000 years ago, were trying to figure out what the nature of individuality was and what the nature of consciousness was. And their presupposition, which was dramatized, because these people told stories, they didn't think.
Level up, Garden, ajmo Garden, level up, level up.
Philosophical, logical,
Može još jedan level up. Odmah na petardu da se vidimo.
Petarda.
which is a natural way for people to think.
Easy peasy.
They came to the conclusion that the object of their ultimate worship was the god who confronted the dragon of chaos, cut it into pieces,
Može
and made the world.
drone
And
facility.
that idea has echoed down through the ages. It's
No,
an idea
parking,
that-
ja trebao sam
This
parking
idea is
možda.
very interesting. So,
Maj
you see
sve
the
jedna je,
castle in the
uskoro
background. We
ćeš
already know what the
napraviti
castle stands
ostale.
for. The castle stands
Evo,
for
ima
order.
i za
And it's
parking.
a multi-walled castle because everyone's protected by multiple walls. But those walls are constantly breached. Now, young people, especially modern young people, are often very cynical about the traditions
A
that
je,
they
sad
inhabit.
trebaju samo ovi
They're cynical about them
fragmenti.
because they
Sad
see the
sam
fact
sve
that the
došao
world
s
is
fragmentima.
theoretically devolving into some kind of environmental catastrophe. And they're cynical because there's
Da.
still war and because there's still
Još
hunger.
shelter da
They're
dignem
cynical
i
because
to će.
often the people who are
Je,
teaching them the
da
traditions
vidim,
don't seem to
vidim.
believe
Do
in them
5. je
themselves.
lagano, posle
It's very
5. je
easy
problem.
Da,
for
jebeno.
young people to look at the traditions that work.
Ne možemo
Upgrade.
da
Vi se
uredimo
ti
15.
traže resurs.
But the truth of the matter is that throughout
Da.
human
Ne
history,
imamo
tradition
ovi
has
crveni,
always
kako
been
da nađemo ove
anachronistic, out of
crvene?
date. And what you see in images of St. George
Na
and the
farmaš,
Dragon
na
is that the
40
dragons
ono.
always breach the walls,
Šta, crvene
which
kutije?
means that tradition is always under attack from chaos.
Ajde, gdje će
Well,
farmaju?
of course it is, because the future's
Ubijaš
perfect in that
titana,
sense.
ubijaš
But that doesn't mean that the
cvijeće,
past should
one
be
biljke i to je
abandoned. Because if you abandon the past and you knock down all your walls, you fall into a pit of chaos.
Craft
And that,
item.
classically speaking,
Armor.
is
police baton.
indistinguishable from hell. And I can tell you that if you spend long enough in that state, you'll become bitter and cruel. Because that's what happens to people.